Hello and welcome back. Now, what I wanted to emphasize in this sort of video is something also incredibly important because insofar as comprehending just how bad of a situation we are in right now with the economy, crumbling schools, fuel poverty, a cost of living crisis, rise in levels of crime of all sorts, and a sincere and very obvious lack of accountability and responsibility that I mentioned yesterday. What I wanted to do here was to sort of describe to you a little bit, guys, about just how much we are told versus what we are not told. And sometimes a lot of this can be hark towards what you read in the press or see or hear. Because more often than not, the news is sort of just meant to be described as just telling people what's been going on. Now, the inherent issue we have here is that it's not always easy to say whenever something has been mentioned versus when something is not mentioned. AKA, how much of the full story are they really covering? Are they going into depth about every single detail? What details are they not discussing? Are there huge glaring oversights? And I mention these things because it would be very, very easy for the average casual observer who has no real eye or ear for politics would look at a newspaper or read a report on Sky News and immediately say that the narrative they're producing is the one truthful one because it's the first thing we've been exposed to, and what evidence do we have to the contrary that they're telling us the full story or their version of events is so accurate that there can't be any room for debate. And this is dangerous, ladies and gentlemen, because if every single person believed everything that, let's say, the Daily Mail or the Daily Express or the Daily Telegraph, then there would be no other oppositional party, and the UK would become a single party state. Because if you eliminate your opposition, then who's going to oppose you then? And it's curious in this light when you also begin to consider the thought about what about other publications that tell us different aspects of the story, or sort of what the Guardian usually do is how they go after other aspects of the news that are they're happening at the same time, but they don't necessarily get brought up in any of the other publications. And this is a very interesting thing to point out because I believe it's something of over 7 million people on the NHS waiting list. And yet the only, and this was just what was reported in today's papers like the Eye, the Independent and the Guardian, and I believe the Daily Mirror may have mentioned as well. And you'll be forgiven for thinking that about these four in particular because they're more left to more neutral terms in terms of journalism and publications. Because in general, I'm actually kind of very against the idea that newspapers should be either left or right wing, absolutely. I think that a newspaper should sort of be on very neutral ground. They should report the facts as facts and not pretend for any one instance that there is one side that is favourable than the other. Now, of course, this is just a mere fantasy because the reality is absolutely nothing like this. But at the same time, it's the only way you can actually get a grasp on the things that are really going on. At least as far as what's being reported in the news, that is. So you could sort of almost actually get a gauge really for how things really are in this country by just going and actually talking to your neighbors, finding out what's going on in the neighborhood or find out what's going on in community groups and stuff like that. Those are sort of more local ways of finding out what's been going on because why should we concern ourselves with the big things when we should be more concerned with the things that the more smaller things, at least the things that we can get a handle on. But back to the matter at hand about bias from journalism and stuff like that and from the papers, because again, you sort of run into an issue, like a really big one, where because more people read the Daily Mail and the Express and the Telegraph or the Times, for example, it would be very, very easy to convince yourselves that these are the only publications that actually print the news that is actually worth being put out into the world, and rather the things that are going to garner the most response. Because it is sort of more the case generally that the opposition are supposed to be the opposition. They are supposed to be the thing that oppose the government. But of lately, it seems as though the opposition, and it could be in whatever context, it could be when we get the next Labour government, or however long this current government will live in its current form, is that there's going to be people with very, very different opinions, and people who will go against the grain to say that the current state of things is simply not working, and simply fixating on something very, very specific is not good enough, because you're sort of downplaying all the other disasters that are currently happening from, like I said, the thing about that was in a lot of the today's papers was about how they think that Keir Starmer's plan for migration is going to allow more asylum seekers to come from Europe, or how the Daily Express, they had a very, very brazen attitude in how they say Suella Braverman scoffs at Labour's idea. This is despite the fact that the Home Office has squandered millions of pounds on prisoner camps in Rwanda to send migrants to, as well as a floating barge that was basically a floating fire hazard. It sort of actually astounds me is that whenever this government, ever talks about the ideas of migration, it's almost like jarring to believe that they are going to start leveling people about the fact that their ideologies are nonsensical, not economically viable, and they find the magic money tree and shake off millions of pounds for projects that have failed. So they're basically setting fire to your money, and somehow they think that entitles them to say that everything is fine and we have got a handle on things. And no matter what, ladies and gentlemen, it seems like I said before yesterday, it seems as though this government, and maybe Liz Truss as well, the entire plan about sending the economy completely out the window wasn't in any way a viable tactic to keep any opposition out of Parliament, because they will have to be tasked with the burden of trying to restore all the damage that the Conservatives have done. And how are they going to do it unless they have some very drastic radical reform on certain issues like fuel, or it could be for employment and stuff like that. But the case is that, how much can they do? And it could be the Green Party, it could be the Liberal Democrats, it could be UKIP, it could be Labour. Someone has got to be able to deal with it. And once again, we find ourselves in a situation where if this government is not going to be tasked with the idea of doing it, then who else is going to pick up the slack and actually create a system in which people will prosper, inflation will be down, and actually something returns to a state of normality where there will be less things like child poverty and, people having to scrimp and save desperately just to make ends meet. It seems almost as though this sort of thing was intentional. It's almost like a purging of the poorest members of society, and even those who are just trying to put money away, and those who are doing quite well and work over 40 hours a week, it seems as though they are going to be the next in line, because, well, economically, it seems to almost have a domino effect. So then what? And besides, and the thing you walk away when you think about all this, and on top of all the other problems from, crumbling schools, or the waiting lists, or fuel and poverty and stuff like that. And why exactly is it also, or like the papers like the Express and the Mail and stuff like that, their only chief concern is migration, and how they are also concerned about poking fun at the opposition, whilst they are seemingly doing nothing but wasting your money to not actually fix the problems. apart from blame everybody else, laugh at everybody else, and to laugh at you, the taxpayer, because, again, this government likes to take people for muppets and make us look stupid. I'm sorry, I'm really, really sorry if I've just literally had to spell it out, but it's absolutely the truth. I'll say this again yesterday. I've probably paid more in tax than the Daily Mail have for the last 10 years. And it stands to reason, because what evidence do I have that the Daily Mail are paying or even want to pay any tax whatsoever? So what exactly makes them any sort of... And that's, again, your thing I talked about, well, with the Daily Express and how Suella, they have a thing where Suella is laughing at Labour and stuff like that. Who exactly are, like, the Express or the Mail now wants to start calling people out on things that are absolutely absurd and ridiculous? It makes them... And we could throw the Sun newspapers in as well. Fuck Rupert Murdoch. And it's just... It's not so much a very confused time, ladies and gentlemen, because there's nothing really confusing in my mind about it. My conscience is actually really, really clear on this. Is that we are living in an age where if we're told that everything is fine, then they will just expect us to believe it, as though they think that the government is the word of God, or that the royal family is the word of God, or he who has the gold makes the rules, so we decide what's working and what doesn't. It's an attitude I absolutely despise, and thank God I don't consider myself anything like that. And like I said before, if you really want to be opposed to this ideology, then don't be like them. Be something that is not inherent to their ideologies of how, again, if we say everything is all right and we tell people everything's all right, we might actually start believing our own lies. You know what I mean? And actually, while we're on the subject, and again, this is why I'm probably going to have to purge this idea as well, because I had an idea like a couple of months ago about how you could tackle things like obesity, unemployment, possibly even migration, almost entirely in like one idea. And that is this, is that here, my idea was literally build about 250 warehouses all across the UK. Let's say 300. Maybe as well make it a round figure. We build 300 warehouses all across the UK. We fit each one of them with about 300 electric bicycles, and they are all attached to one generator, or rather more a dynamo. We fit these to dynamos, and they fit them to a generator, and you employed people to cycle 8 hours a day to generate electricity. And again, the reason why I have to say like 300 warehouses and 300 bikes is because just to generate that amount of energy, it would require almost an en masse level of workmanship. It probably would need to be something close to about like 500 warehouses just to generate that much of much electricity. And I'm not talking about just using these things as like on the levels of like, say, national service or means of actually, or even you could even fit some of these in prisons, and you may as well give them something to do to actually contribute back to at their debt to society. Perhaps I don't exactly know if this is the sort of thing that prisoners or prisons would even think about doing, and whether or not, But the idea is that if we're going to have, if there's going to be unemployment at all, then there should also be jobs out there that they can absolutely do, because you could run it at something like, let's say, minimum wage, and the advantages of this job is that you burn calories, so you get yourself into a more like active lifestyle. You contribute actually something relatively menial, perhaps, but as a whole unit, you're paving the way in terms of how we can generate more power without having to, ultimately consume things like filling up every single field and mountainside in the country with wind turbines. And you could probably even get a lot of people like engineers or electrical fitters or machine fitters some level of work by building dynamos or building these electric bikes and having them all in place. You could even probably, in fact, even if the scheme worked well, you could probably get nearly 1 million people off universal credit if 1 million of them were ready to shift themselves to work and literally pedal from 9 till 5 and then come away again feeling as though not only have they lost weight, but not only are they in work, but they're also earning from literally being healthier by losing weight. And again, the actual maths and scientific figures is something that I'm not entirely sure if it's viable in that sense either, because I don't necessarily know how many calories you would have to like burn in 8 hours just to like for the figures to like equal out so that actually any electricity is generated at all. Then of course they would need like a lunch hour, I would say, just to like gain some of their energy back. So really they're sort of like pedaling for 3.5 hours at a time, and if we get to that in that sense. But then again, 7 hours of hard pedaling, that literally could result in burning like close to 3,000 calories a day. You could probably even do it something on the lines of, let's say, a labor exchange, where if you feel like you were up to the task, you could come in, you could sign on, and they would pay you for that day. And then if you were not feeling up to it the next day, because again, the sort of people this would employ, it's not necessarily designed maybe towards those like Olympic levels of trainees, but it's more designed for just people to like, allow them to contribute something in return. But again, like I said, it's only a very rough idea in the fullness of time, and it's probably also true that there were some very serious objections to it, because it runs along the lines of, you're not really building, a revolutionary idea. It's more harkened to the idea that you're building a plantation as opposed to a power plant. But nevertheless, if you're being paid for it and if you're allowed to go home and there are benefits to it, then is it really a plantation? You know what I mean? It's again one of those things you have to like outline, and so that people don't get the wrong idea. Some people will ultimately ignore that anyway and will just print whatever they like about it, because again, it's that sort of idea that is bound to garnish trouble if the benefits are far more than any discredit or disillusionary ideas people will give to it. But here legislation could accomplish something, because with a few general ideas, and if it was even something that had any sort of backing or had an idea towards it in terms of where the country is going or how you can actually make things better for everything else, then a few well-directed rules could actually make something like these general. Because remember, if we're going to be having more people come to the UK at all, and if there's going to be an increasing level of unemployment, and if we're going to be moving into the direction of things being electrically powered rather than things reliant on fossil fuels, then, and if we're also going to make a racket about things like obesity and, heart disease, and how a lot of these things are on the cases, then the solution to literally have people earn by losing weight and actually, in retrospect, giving something back would impose itself almost automatically, not by silly restrictions that would almost never be tolerated in any other European country. Again, I don't know if this is just a flight of fancy or this is something that actually has any sort of force behind it, because you know what? I would probably do it. If we had a thing that was like a night shift, so that people would be working almost, these sort of warehouses would be working 24/7. But it would also imply that, again, some people would be working 24/7, or some people would be, again, if the demand was there and we had plenty of resources, and that actually it was a more optional and very alternative way of claiming, and also giving, again, the idea sort of stems in the back of my mind is that if people start losing weight and they start, it develops, other things develop in tow, like healthier lifestyles, or again, reducing the amount they actually intake, and how there's actually a very good way of actually earning and doing positive things for this, then I don't think it's a bad thing at all, because it's got to be better than nothing, I think. What do you guys reckon? And with that being said, I will thoroughly await and can't wait to see your thoughts on this particular case. One headline, why believe it, as Tears of Fears would say. Everybody wants to rule the world.